So my name is Deanna Fong. I'm the literary editor here at the Capilano Review. And I guess we'll begin the event. So to start, we'd first like to acknowledge that the Capilano Review carries out its operations on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We also want to acknowledge that Capilano, in the title of our magazine, Capilano Review, is an anglicization of the Indigenous name Capilano, and has been used without acknowledgement since the magazine was founded at Capilano College, which is now Capilano University, in 1972. And so as part of our mission to foster sort of ongoing equitable and reciprocal relations with the territories that we carry out our work on and with, we have started a conversation that's called, that's about the name Capilano. Jackie's going to post the link in the chat if you want to have a look at the sort of discussion that we've been having. And also as part of that mission, we've recently put out a call for an associate editor who will be editing our forthcoming Indigenous Places and Names series. And actually the deadline for that position is tomorrow. So if you have any contacts who would really like to apply for this position, Jackie is also going to put that call in the chat. And if you can think of anybody, or if you yourself want to apply, we would really love to hear from you. So I'd like to acknowledge that personally, I'm speaking to you today from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. And I'd like to invite all of you participants and audience members to add territory acknowledgements in the chat if you wish. So before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping / Zoom etiquette to let you know the event is being recorded. So if you want to remain anonymous, you can turn off your video camera, and you can also change your screen name by clicking on the 3 dots at the top right of your video window and selecting rename. So you can anonymize yourself or choose whatever pseudonym you wish. Closed captioning is also available for the event and can be activated by clicking the CC button at the top of your, or at the bottom of your screen, sorry. We ask that the audience keep their mics muted during the panel, and that the panelists also mute their mics when they're not speaking, except of course in the Q&A, where you're welcome to raise your hand and ask a question and unmute. Our managing editor, Lauren, who has the Capilano Review name there, will be monitoring the arrival of new participants as well as the chat. If you have comments as the panel is unfolding, you're welcome to put them in the chat. Just note that everybody will see them. The Capilano Review is committed to ensuring an inclusive and respectful environment for all that is free of harassment, violence, and discrimination. Will not tolerate any disrespectful conduct at the event and are committed to preventing and eliminating appropriate behavior through active moderation. If you have any questions or require technical support during the event, you can send a direct message to our arts editor, Jacqueline, who also has the Capilano Review name there at the top, by sending her a direct message through the chat. So a little bit about the structure of the event and how it will unfold. I'm going to ask each presenter to read a short excerpt from their work that appears in TCR in our anniversary issue. I'll kick us off with a short moderated discussion, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A, and you can ask any questions that might arise during the readings. If you have a question and you want it asked anonymously, you can post it in the chat and I can read it out loud for you. And although we did say that the event will last an ambitious 3 hours on the event invite, I think it's only going to be about an hour and a half. But thank you for your enthusiasm and being here with us anyway. So just to start, I wanted to say a little bit about the reason this panel exists and the sort of thinking behind curating it. So I started my position as the literary editor at the Capilano Review in June, and the 3rd anniversary issue, which is 3.48, was the first issue that I had worked on. And so basically like all of the content was in for that already. I just had the pleasure of reading through it with a fine-tooth comb and really getting to sort of like live with and inhabit the pieces that are in it. And in that close reading, I was really struck by the number of pieces in this volume that really directly address this notion of poetics. So kind of directly or obliquely reflecting on how poetic language makes its meaning. And of course, like all the variety of approaches and thought to the genre of the poetics essay. So I was really keen to put together a panel that sort of put those voices into conversation. And anecdotally, so I used to go to a lot of punk shows as a teenager, hall shows and that sort of thing. And I liked watching the bands, but I always more liked hanging out in the parking lot, talking about watching the bands. And I think this is the thing that's like really for me sort of like solidified this interest in the sort of surrounding sociality of cultural production, of which I feel like this panel, you know, sort of hanging out and talking about the bands or about the music after the show. The Poetics Essay kind of maybe fulfills that function a little bit, or it like, anyway, resounds in that way for me. So anyway, yes, we assembled this panel under the common thread that a poetics essay is a treatise on how we relate to each other or how we relate to an other, whether that other is a kind of, is the reader, a writerly community, a readerly public, or that sort of shifting amorphous poetic you through the possibilities of inventive language. So I'll leave it there by way of an introduction. And so I will invite our first reader, which is Jami Macarty. Jami Macarty recognizes the Native nations of the West as the traditional and rightful owners of the lands where she has the great privilege to live and learn, as a teacher at Simon Fraser University, as an independent editor, and as a writer of essays, reviews, and poetry. Jami is the author of The Minuses, published by the Center for Literary Publishing in 2020, winner of the 2020 New Mexico Arizona Book Award, Poetry Arizona, and 3 chapbooks, including Spring of Mind from Vallum, winner of the 2017 Vallum Chapbook Award. Here is Jami.
Thank you, Deanna. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Good afternoon. Let me just take a sip here. I'm going to be reading a excerpt from my piece called Space and the Unworded within my poems. I'm going to start partway into the piece and we'll see how that goes. Before a poem arrives to the reader, the felt sense and felt experience are the guides to a poem's spatial relations among words, spaces, silences, and page. When it comes to the poem's form, the felt sense and felt experience of the poem guide the poet to the placement and locale of words and other than words within poem and page. Just as the poem has a within, the page has a within. Words are inhabitants of the page. Think Charles Olson's field with wilda words roaming it. So the starting 8.5 by 11 or other page field, the roaming wilda words, and the spaces among them are 3-dimensional, like grazers in a summer pasture or birds in a winter birch. Wilda words find and assert positions in the page field, sometimes loosely clustered as mates, sometimes tightly roosted for safety, other times widely distanced. What's left unworded, should the poem choose, are ghost words, spaces, silences, not sayings. These phantoms can beckon readers to a seldom visited extra dimension of spaciousness, of space within space consciousness in the page field. Ghost words are not words that have been taken out of the poem. They are, in some cases, thoughts unuttered, air unvibrated, words that linger at the edges, not yet entering the poem, but still hugging the tree line of the field, that liminal ecotone where field and forest meet, that's neither field nor forest. These ghost words are present, are a presence, but in a form other than text, word, and sound. Ghost words take the form of air, of space, and silence, existing in their own charged, alive reality. The position of ghost words and wilda words in the page field may be dictated, may be whispered or intimated through the multi, the omni, the extrasensory, via the auditory, visual, and temporal, the proxemic and semantic. To be in service of the poem's sounds, silences, and their timings, which are in service of the poem's projections, kinetics, and thematics, there's listening to and hearing of the poem in and over time. This in listening, this sequenced in hearing, creates conditions for the poem to grow into its form, to expand in its field, the grass meadow of the page with woody shrubs, bare ground, and tree lines with various slopes, depressions, and streams, the wilda words and ghost words navigate. It's the hearing of and listening to the poem as I read it aloud to myself at varied pitch, pace, tone, and intonation of voice, listening for its speech, non-speech, breath, and held breath patterns that guides line breaks and how space arranges itself within the poem. This is a meeting of the topographic with the typographic. Spaces only make sense in, of, and to the cadence established by words and lines within the poem. And the listening and hearing allow me, the poet, to get as close as possible to the raw sounds and real timing of the words the poem utters and stutters, the silences, lacuna, and ellipses it needs and claims. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jami. That was so evocative when I first read that piece, thinking about the ghost words and wilda words hanging out in the long shadow of Charles Olson's poetic field. So thank you so much for that. Next, we're going to hear from Larissa Lai. Larissa Lai has written 9 books, including The Tiger Flu, Iron Goddess of Mercy, and most recently, The Lost Century, all from Arsenal Pulp Press. The most recent, a historical novel about war, colonialism, love, and loyalty during Japan's occupation of Hong Kong in World War II. Recipient of the Duggins Novelist Prize, the Lambda Literary Award, and the Estrella Award, she holds a Canada Research Chair at the University of Calgary, where she directs the Insurgent Architects House for creative writing. Here is Larissa.
Thank you so much, Deanna. I'm actually going to mostly talk, and I'll just set a little timer for myself so I don't talk too long. So my entry for the collection is I think it took the dictionary aspect a little bit seriously. The language is a little dry. I'm just going to read a little bit, and then I'm going to explain. I'll explain and sort of walk you through it, because it unfolds in a curious way. So my entry is called Kanshi. I'll just read the first page or so. Scholars in the Heian period in Japan, that is, from the middle of the 7th century to 1185, wrote poetry in both Chinese and Japanese. There are 2 terms for the Chinese language writing that they did. Kanshi means Chinese poetry, and Kambun means Chinese prose. I. Smits, however, tells us that the designations Kanshi and Kambun are Western designations, and further queries whether Sino-Japanese poetry is in fact Chinese, or is better understood as a form of Japanese. In the heyday of Kanshi, there were 2 principal forms in which poetry could be written in Japanese, the tenka and the choka. The tenka was limited to 32 syllables. The choka followed a similar rhythm to the tenka, but was unlimited in length. However, in the Heian period, the choka dropped almost entirely out of use. Kanshi, like choka, stipulated no rules around length. Though early kanshi were quite short, when poets did wish to write long, it was an obvious and available form to go to. Minamoto no Shitago, 911 to 983, thus wrote Song of the Tailless Ox as kanshi. Burton Watson, the American translator of both Chinese and Japanese, wonders whether, had choka been in style, Minamoto might have written this song in Japanese instead. And so here's a little scrap from Minamoto. I have an ox, but its tail is missing. Everyone pokes fun at my tailless ox. Born a wild calf, it was chewed by a wolf, but I well understand why it escaped the wolf's jaws. It's so wise, you'd take it for an old pine spirit, far plumper and bigger than those grazers under the fruit trees. So the essay starts like that, and I'm sort of I'm thinking about this form. Well, one thing I should have said is, if you would have given me the letter H, I would have written about haibun. And so this reach into kanshi is a deep reach for me, but the project seemed to call for it, or the chance operation or something sort of seemed to say, okay, Larissa, now's the time for you to face this form. So this is what the essay is doing. So I think about this question of Japanese poets imitating Chinese forms to say the things they need to say. And then I attend to the translator, Watson, who's intensely worrying about whether or not these kanji written by Japanese poets are any good. And the next page or so queries that question of quality and wonders, Watson is really worried about what he calls oddities of word order. He's afraid that the Japanese poets are betraying their Japaneseness by ordering the language in a Japanese way rather than a Chinese way. And so I wonder whether, if, since the Chinese prose itself is not governed by word order, why these Japanese linguistic patterns, habits should be a problem, or why they should be less graceful than Chinese linguistic patterns, which is a thing that Watson is really sort of worried about in his scholarship on the work of kanshi. And then I talk about another poet whom Watson's really fond of, called Sugiwara no Michizane, and tell his story and give a little scrap of his poetry. It's very beautiful and very sad, but I don't have the time to read it all for you here. So I do that, and then I make a little move where I start thinking, or start talking to you, I guess, the reader, as to why I'm doing this in the first place, because it does seem such a stretch for a poet like me. And so I think a little bit about Watson in the first instance, who is an ex-Navy man. Oh, sorry, actually, I think about myself first. And why I might be interested in this bureaucrat scholar, Michizane, or a translator like Watson. And I say, as a poet whose mother tongue has evaded her and who, as a child, betrayed her mother tongue under pressure from Canadian multiculturalism and the Newfoundland schoolyard of my youth, I need the translators in order to understand where I've come from. I betrayed my mother tongue before I knew what language was. My mother taught me English first, so I wouldn't have an accent. And then I think about Watson and his location, first of all, as an ex-Navy person, so somebody involved in the military, who is a translator of both Chinese and Japanese, has a posting in China during World War II, is probably gay, although he's of a generation where nobody says that overtly. And then I think about my relationships with my Japanese Canadian friends. So it's really paratactic, it's jumping around quite a bit. And the problem of World War II and tension between Chinese and Japanese locations, and what that might mean for relationships between somebody like me and the many poets, writers, artists, and critics who are Japanese Canadian and who have been my friends and mentors since forever. Okay, and so then in the next move, I start to think about what the term Asian Canadian does and what the term Asian might be good for, and recognize that it's good for coalition building, but that it's also really fraught because of its use during this. It's fraught because of its use during the Second World War, in which it was used in deeply fascist ways to push Japanese imperialism across Asia. But its prior use before that was potentially quite liberatory and connected as well to Pan-African movements. And so I'm thinking about all of this stuff, and then I return to the idea of kanshi and all of the possibilities of relationship across these vast swaths of time through these Asian territories, and what those might, when those might potentially repeat themselves or come to emerge again in the present moment. And so the last little line just says, to engage kanshi is to step into the house of the adjacent other, and there to look in the mirror in order to see oneself, and so become oneself differently. All right, thanks for that. I hope that made some kind of sense. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Larissa. I want to footnote an idea for myself here, this idea of poetics somehow being involved with rules, the rules of language, the rules of expression. And I liked what you said about the grace of following or breaking those rules. So footnoting that for later. Next is D.S. Marriott. D.S. Marriott teaches at Emory University, where he is the Charles T. Winship Professor of Philosophy. His most recent books include Before Whiteness by City Lights in 2022, Lacan Noir, Lacan Afro-Pessimism from Palgrave in 2021, and Whither Fanon, Studies in the Blackness of Being from Stanford in 2018. D.S. Marriott currently lives in Atlanta.
Thank you, Deanna, and thank you, Jackie, as well. And thanks to everybody for being here. I got the letter V. I'm not sure if that's a long or short straw, but the first words I thought about in response to this was virtue or violence. Why? Probably is a question best left to a psychoanalyst. But I ended up with the word voice. And so that's what I'm going to speak about. So it's a short little essay. So here goes. In the history of the voice, Edward Camus Brathwaite refers to a submerged language that African slaves had brought with them to the Caribbean. This submerged voice, or at least its echo, quote, was itself constantly transforming itself into new forms, unquote, with the archipelago itself emerging from the seas as a new track for desire and language. Indeed, this voice resounds as a power of transformation, articulating new sounds and meanings. But submergence also refers to the suppression of its voice by imperial locutions, a fact that leads Brathwaite to say that in modern Caribbean writing, there has always been a struggle to regain and or suppress or deny these syllabic echoes as the ultimate expression and symbol of our slave past. So it's in his attempt to free the submerged voice from what he calls the pentameter, Brathwaite refers to his own experiments, his word, in what he calls nation languages. Nation language shares lexical affinities with English, but not its syntax, rhythm, say, or timbre, word order. It teaches us how to sound the depths of our wretchedness and gives us the means to rehear what has been silenced or lost. And then he goes on to describe what this nation language is or sounds like. And he says, nation language is revolutionary, surreal, and speaks in dialect. Brathwaite describes it as a howl, a shout, a machine gun. But it can also be heard in wind, tornado, and wave. It puts a word on the same level as plant, fauna, and beasts. That is to say, quote, noise is part of the meaning. Noise is part of the meaning, unquote. Here sound designates a continuum between voice and virtue and vox, but only insofar as earthly languages are able to echo an infinite, what he calls, being in common. Here, language is no longer a symbol of the human, but a means of obtaining the a-human, which we do not understand merely as logos, or to use another Greek word, dianoia, logic, calculation, that kind of language, but as a kind of light and visibility filled with revolutionary understanding. What other characteristics does nation language have? Again, he goes on to say, aside from rhythm, patois, syllable clusters, blues notes, etc., there's also ostinato, syncopation, caesuras, along with what he calls reverberation. All these forms say amen to the pentameter, all say amen to the tyranny and the glory, the innocence and perfection of a Black submerged world. So my question in relationship to Brathwaite's language is as follows. So what does it mean to be submerged in these kinds, these forms, these materials and forms of language? And what does this submergence say? Why is it a symbol of nation? Here, hence, what is not heard, because submerged, hidden, obscure, is sublated or sublates itself as a symbol, as a harmonization or sonorous equivalence of revolution and enslavement, that is, metaphors or themes of nationhood. But what I think is really interesting about the essay, History of the Voice, is that it remains interested in what he calls a voicelessness that cannot be sublated as the voice of anything but language. A voice that subverts any notion of language as articulation, communication, etc. And that notion of voice is, I believe, to be found in a principle that withdraws and abandons any notion of rule, vox, or community. Or, and this is my argument, I would say, it communes with something deeper, higher, and more abstract than any kind of meaning, be that of race, nation, or community. And it's that enigmatic voicing which I hear in Brathwaite's descriptions of a language which incites revolt, the revolt of sound against sense, and is so apart from symbol or figuration that it becomes an asymptote of two eternities meeting in the line. So again, he goes on to describe a Black sound that is pursued and carried off by the line, as line, beyond the horizon of the line. But he also goes on to describe what he calls incomprehensible infinitudes that tempt and distress any attempt to figure or answer them, to dominate or master them, to subdue or charm them. And these dark amplitudes are what he then goes on to call reverberations. So here, to use a bit of a cliche, sound is not an echo to the sense, nor is it more than sense, nor is it simply opposed to meaning, nor is it more meaningful than sense. What I'm interested in is that moment when what is uttered is not what is meant, heard, or imagined, but is the disjunctive relation of both sound and sense, and vice versa. So what we're really talking about is the sounding of their disunity, in which voices are plunged, nay, submerged into what he calls these black rifts in language, which have become the sensual, sonorous, and experiential realities of modern Black poetry. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. As somebody who's been a long time invested in this question of how language relates to the voice, I have to say that essay just like fired me right up with its materiality and specificity, and maybe a possibility of talking about the voice universally. I don't know, maybe we'll talk about it later.
Sure.
But thank you so much for that. Next is Nicole Brossard. Nicole Brossard is a poet, novelist, and essayist from Montreal. Her first publication was in 1965. She was a Governor General Literary Award recipient in 1974 and 1984. Her most recent book in English translation is Avant Desire, an anthology of her work edited by Sina Kira, Geneviève Robichaud, and Aaron Wunker. In 2019, she received the Griffin Lifetime Recognition Award. Here is Nicole.
Thank you very much. Yes, I had the word ellipsis, and I was very happy to receive that word because I think it's one of the dynamics of my writing. The text is, some part is in French and some part, of course, in English. Since the project is about an absence, first I should define and then refine my intention regarding the ellipsis, its whirlwind in time, brushing with love the never-ending word abîme, and force myself to a jump not yet snuggled in a definition I can't yet imagine for fear of endless stories. Temps d'arrêt, ou chute lente, l'ellipse ressurgit, vent hurlant de nanosecondes, un aller-retour fulgurant entre je suis ici, stylo, main ferme et dos penché, je suis là, dans l'ombre cosmique du prochain mot, je traduis avec des verbes quantiques. Stop or slow fall, the ellipses surges, howling wind of nanoseconds, dazzling goings and comings. Between here, I am, and firm, leaning back over where I am, awaiting for the cosmic shadow of the next word, translating with quantum verbs. J'aime la vitesse d'une phrase. L'ellipse l'accentue. Je m'ennuierais s'il fallait tout faire selon la règle. La vitesse des pensées nous soumet à un aller-retour constant, mais imperceptible, entre penser avec des mots, les tracer ou les dactylographier, et la saisie simultanée de l'intuition qui permet de les faire apparaître dans l'ordre syntaxique tout en ordonnant de nouvelles séquences sémantiques. Prise au piège de la vitesse, certains mots restent en suspens entre la pensée et la phrase écrite. D'autres vont se perdre dans l'espace de la rêverie et de chaos imaginaire. Certes, ces mots continuent d'exister, disons d'errer dans la conscience, et leur réinsertion dans le texte variera selon les actes d'écriture à venir, ainsi que les actes de lecture de chacun et de chacune. Ardor. Ellipses are frequent when one enters in a state of ardor. I like to write with this tension. When prose wants to infiltrate the poem, the ellipsis brings a form of resistance, a way of stopping its encroachment on the poem. Ellipsis is at the heart of the poem. It creates contrast, ambiguities, astonishments, and a pleasure of blank and image. Dynamique de l'ellipse. En ces temps où les biotechnologies nous obligent à recadrer et à jauger le sens et la nature de notre humanité, il m'a semblé que l'ellipse prend des manières de spasme, comme si elle ne pouvait plus harmoniser la voix, l'élan de vie et les raccourcis à partir desquels nous pouvons nous ouvrir au monde. Il semblerait que devant la plasticité du sens et la multiplication des hoquets de haine contemporains, le désir se tourne vers une langue simplifiée, nous éloignant peu à peu de l'ellipse et de l'obligation qu'elle fait naître de rétablir mentalement le sens. Sans l'ellipse, il semblerait qu'une partie de notre joie ludique et de notre vigilance mentale s'érode. Since we are talking about absence, a gap forcing us to mentally reassemble words as sheaves, as in a backstage we start to breathe again, pointing with a trembling hand, old joys and loops of childhood went silent. Comment ouvrir l'espace, y engouffrer des joyaux d'alphabet, latin, cyrillique, grec, arménien, géorgien et angoule, des groupes de consonnes et de voyelles, la conscience à l'écoute de l'univers venant vers soi. Do you remember how to open space so as to engulf jewels of alphabets, teams of consonants and vowels shaping consciousness from the universe to the self till your eyes close? The ellipsis always makes space for a trill, still suddenly you are left with un présent d'absence. Ellipsis, slim waist, closed eyelids, and tango. To all the ellipses, from the mouth to the beat of the heart, to the mysterious folds in the sentence, the sudden falling on your knees, until you uncover your own lyricism, to all the voids, the urgencies for a blue sky, the invisible design at the origin of the ellipses. This overflow of joy slowly canceling the narrative self. Merci.
Merci, Nicole. Love that. And just the ultimate capaciousness of the ellipsis as resistance, as placeholder, as velocity, all these various forms. So thank you so much for that. And our final speaker to this afternoon / evening is Stephen Collis. Stephen Collis is the author of a dozen books of poetry and prose, including The Commons, On the Material, Once in Blockadia, and A History of the Theories of Rain, all by Talon Books. He lives near Vancouver on unceded Coast Salish territory and teaches poetry and poetics at Simon Fraser University. Here's Stephen.
Thanks, Deanna. Thanks everyone for coming out today, and thanks to TCR for all the work you guys have put in this year on these 3 volumes. It's a pretty incredible project, so kudos on that. I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Tsawwassen people, the land facing the sea. It's a good day to be near the sea today. I got the word at the letter T, so my word is tangle, and I'm just going to read an excerpt from that piece. On or about the end of the last century, during the Q&A after a reading in Vancouver at the Kootenai School of Writing, poet Steve McCaffrey was asked about the ubiquity of collage as a guiding avant-garde trope throughout the past 100 years. What comes next after the century of collage? Someone asked. The tangle, McCaffrey answered. Quantum entanglement is a theory of the connectivity of subatomic systems. Particles don't move independently, but are correlated or entwined, even across vast gulfs of space-time. Physicist Brian Greene writes, quote, "We used to think that a basic property of space is that it separates and distinguishes one object from another. But we see that quantum mechanics radically changes this view. 2 things can be separated by an enormous amount of space and yet not have a fully independent existence." End quote. I think poetry's task is entanglement, not to separate, not to clearly demarcate or discern, not to disentangle what has become knotted, fouled, indivisible, but to further entangle. Poetry is a means of identifying our entanglements, of articulating that complexity from which, for better or for worse, we are inseparable. It is a method for entering the tangle, for following fouled lines, for circulating again and again back through knots already encountered that only become tighter, more deeply interconnected to any line we might follow. The poetic line is no Ariadne's thread to follow out of the labyrinth. It is a labyrinthine tangle of lines that only lead back into the maze. My thinking here is bound up with what Tim Ingold's exploration of a comparative anthropology of the line in his book, Lines of Brief History. Ingold asks us to imagine life, quote, as a manifold woven from the countless threads spun by beings of all sorts, both human and non-human, as they find their ways through the tangle of relationships in which they are enmeshed, end quote. The shift here is ontological. Quote, people inhabit a world that consists not of things, but of lines. After all, what is a thing or indeed a person, if not a tying together of the lines, the paths of growth and movement of all the many constituents gathered there, end quote. The implications for how we might approach human movement, one of the key aspects of the present, are instructive. Ingold quotes Roy Wagner. The life of a person is the sum of his tracks, the total inscription of his movements. My friend Osman is a sum of tracks, a complex inscription of movements. I see him move northwest along a line out of Africa, across the Mediterranean and Europe, until his trajectory eventually intersects the line I describe, traveling east from North America by chance or design near a village in the UK where yellowhammers sing from the hedgerows we follow together. We have few experiences in common. We barely share a functional form of communication, and a gulf yawns between his precarity and my privilege. And yet the lines we have traveled have become knotted together, can no longer be separated. Each summer we meet to walk across landscapes where neither of us are at home, although home is a complex notion and nothing is really still for long. Our knot entangles a mediating plant, a sprig of lavender Osman finds and tucks in his cap, a plant native to the North African coast of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, where Osman started his journey, and now grown over half the world. And so he grows lavender in the garden of the Refugee Welcome Center where he works in Cardiff. Lavender and lavender oil help him sleep. And I plant lavender in my own garden in Osman's name and honor, halfway around the earth. We send each other pictures of ourselves posing with our plants. And I think the plant is as much a mobile participant in our mutuality as I am or Osman is. At night, our dreams blew towards purple. Bees, it's thought, might be able to see quantum fields, and so they use this to dance the coordinates, say, of lavender bushes, providing a conceptual map for the hive. If there were a quantum poetry, I think it would be collocative, echolocationary. It would thread sites separated in space and time through a knot they would form one with the other. There are moments, I know, when Osman is walking in England and I am walking here thousands of kilometers away at the same moment, which is nonetheless a different time of day, and we emerge afterwards online together and at once laugh at our synchronized movements. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Ooh, well, I think we're beginning to get a sense of the deep entanglements in these 5 pieces and the connections, the sparks between them. So I think I'll kick us off with a couple of questions. I don't want to take up too much space here because I'm sure there are questions from the audience as well. But where I wanted to start is with the quotation that provided the name of this panel, which is a partly common language, and that's taken from Adrienne Rich's piece, Someone is Writing a Poem. And the quotation is this: most often someone writing a poem believes in, depends on a delicate vibrating range of difference, that an I can become a we without extinguishing others, that a partly common language exists to which strangers can bring their own heartbeat, memories, images. And to me, this is really articulates the kind of ethical quandary at the heart of writing poetry, which is how can poetry navigate this sort of very delicate relationship between ourselves and others, an I and a we, and how do we sort of ethically ignite that connection through language without extinguishing another, I guess. So basically a sort of opening question here about how poetry puts us into relation with various others. So I'll let any of our panelists sort of jump onto that, or
We're all being polite, aren't we? Maybe I'll just kick off really, really simply and straightforwardly by just saying that I hear and feel everything you just said and everything in that quotation from Rich, Deanna, and think about it obsessively and specific to my friend Osman. And, you know, he and I are both involved in a project that we work on. There's essentially advocacy for people seeking asylum in the UK, specifically people who've been detained, immigration detention in the UK. So we're in the habit of being public about this and talking about it and sharing stories. And Osman doesn't like to talk so much publicly because English is like his 5th or 6th language, and you know, he doesn't need to have that pressure to try and perform it publicly, but he's super engaged with what he's been through and having people talk about it and discussing it with them. And he's got an incredible form of communication he's evolved that involves, he actually articulates himself quite well, I think. But there's a lot of body language and hand gesture and story through hand gestures and acting things out. Anyhow, I've known him for 7 years, and I'm fascinated by him and by what he has to say. And it's just, all I can say is it's just an open-ended struggle of figuring out how to do that ethically, because I'm convinced there is some commonality there, some human commonality that you have to be so careful at trying to parse it out when some of the differences are so striking.
thanks, Steve.
Yes, I could pipe up. I also think about this question a lot, Deanna, and I didn't know that rich quote. I really appreciate it. It's very beautiful. When you were speaking of a common a partly common language, what first came to mind for me was Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto and the dream of a common language, which actually has curious parallels. But so for this particular piece, yeah, I guess I am really sort of trying to think about a kind of an adjacent reach across. I feel if there's, you know, a struggle that many of us have been inhabiting, well, ever since forever, really, in the question of how, yeah, to be together with others across fields of, you know, and I mean, the older I get and the more I sit with folks and the more I read, the more I understand how vast those fields of difference are, you know, and that actually the Canadian project of multiculturalism is one of a tremendous violence because it tries to make, you know, of equal valence, all of these sort of experiences of being in the body, of being in race, of being in gender, of it tries to make them, it tries to level everything out, and we lose so much of what our relation with one another has been, both for better and worse, and sets us up for these very strange kinds of struggles that are really, I find really hard. It's really difficult to have the conversation about them in the public arena. I think it's because of a very bizarre way that the Canadian national public has been set up, actually, so that those of us, particularly who are inhabiting racialized locations, have difficulty speaking across to one another. It's very difficult to do so in ways that are not oppositional, but the opposition, you know, opposition and the work of the dialectic is not always what's needed. And so this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. So the most recent poetry book, Iron Goddess of Mercy, that's going on for sure. And in this new novel of the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, again, really, really difficult and painful to write because of close friendships with like so many, so many JC, as I was saying, so many JC friends here. And one of the things that I was particularly conscious about formally working on Iron Goddess of Mercy, when I first wrote it, I wasn't sure what it was doing formally. The high bun turned out to be the thing that worked. And of course, I learned that from Fred Waugh, who I know is in the room. And I struggled with the fact that it's actually a Japanese form. It's not a Chinese form. What are us, naughty Chinese Canadians doing, ripping our JC friends off, stealing this form, right? And then there's a moment where in Timothy Yu's book, Race in the Avant-Garde, where he's writing about Fred's work, and he says, well, at this point, the high bun is just kind of like a North American Pan-Asian form that any of us ought to be able to take up. And I'm like, Tim, I'm not, I'm really not sure about that. I mean, I have taken it up. It is an appropriation, like there's no getting around the appropriation of that. And so a big part of my interest in kind of taking up Kanchi was to see, it was exciting to discover Kanchi as a form because it shows a kind of a trading back and forth of these forms in ways that are fraught and uneven and don't necessarily resolve. And I think it's the difficulty, of we don't get to have clean hands, and we have to inhabit the difference. And it's often painful and not easy. And I think that's the difficulty. That's the difficulty. And so, actually everybody in this room has been talking about it one way or the other, the need for modes that are sensical and modes that are not, for sound, for silence, for those moments when language kind of, erupts to the surface and you get a connect, but also the necessity of all of those moments when you don't, you get something partial, as you're saying, or you get an entanglement. And if there's something that I would say, I think I'm doing, just to pick up Steve's the thread metaphor, I think that I'm not, and it's not so much entangling, but it's stitching that I'm doing. So there is a kind of feminine labor in a kind of reassembling that I've been thinking about a lot. Like a few years ago, somebody accused me, and not meaning to be kind at all, of suturing in the bad Derridian way. And I went away and I thought about it. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. But it's not, I'm okay with the dirt of it. And I also think it's necessary labor. If some of us can sort of see the way to sort of, thread those connections where in those places where it's been rent. And I have more, but maybe I'll leave it there.
I'll just talk a little bit about the genesis for this piece. I wasn't assigned S for space through TCR. It evolved or manifested out of a conversation I was having with another with a group of writers who were curious about the way poems occupy space on the page, in particular my poems. And so there was a direct reach, a direct conversation among a collective in which I was asked this question and tried to answer it. And that's where this piece comes. So I think of it as quite intimate, quite close, the conversation, the unfolding, that the we is in some cases two, and in particular for a poem, between the poem and the reader, that relationship, or the poet and the reader. And if I'll just, the spaces for me in writing allow for everything, virtual multitudes, but maybe particularly allow for you, the reader, the listener.
Thanks, Jami.
I'll just say very quickly, in response to your question, Deanna, I'm concerned about who gets to name the stranger. Doesn't that rely on a prior presupposition that a stranger can be recognized as such? And that means that there's already a presumed sense of commonness. So you can say somebody is estranged from that. Well, that to me is precisely what's always in question. And I think if there was something was genuinely estranged, you wouldn't recognize it, and you wouldn't be in a relationship to it. It would put you into some kind of crisis or self-doubt, or at least some kind of challenge as to what your presupposition of what the world is. And that to me is a genuine ethical encounter. And that's what I expect from the poem. So for me, the poem is the stranger, if you want to put it like that, but I'm not in a relation to it. In a sense, if I encounter what I mean by this poem, it's a kind of ruination. It's not a being with. That to me is implies some kind of equality or kind of some prior recognition, which I think is always in dispute.
Excellent, thank you. Oh, Nicole, you're muted.
Okay. Yes. Okay. I would just like to say a few words about the I and the we. Many years ago, which probably was 20, 30 years ago, I was saying all the time that it happens once in a while in history that the I and the we can work together. When a writer pronounces I, everyone understands we, and when a writer pronounces we, everyone suddenly understands it's about me. I again appears. And this moments I have experienced as a Quebecoise and as a woman and as a lesbian as well, in 3 different ways. But it was the only moment when we all understand or can be able to do the traffic between the pronoun I and the pronoun we. So it all concerns us because we know for sure that it's all about us for 5 minutes, for an hour, for a few weeks. And so because otherwise the relation is the poet writing, the writer is writing, is alone, or she is alone when they write. They write about their universe, what they capture about the universe and what the universe gives them. And therefore, the reader, if we're talking about reader or listener, is very different. And therefore, the reader very often, which will be able to connect with them, is a reader that shares their priority. Sometimes their priority will be about affective relationship. It can be about cities, it can be about the body, it can be whatever the theme is. And also how they believe, they behave in the act of reading itself. Sometimes I know, for example, that there are work of they leave books that excites me very much because I have the impression that I'm talking mind to mind with another writer. Sometimes for others, it will be I'm talking art to art with another, or I'm talking experience to experience with another writer. But it is difficult for me to imagine that I would make, how could I say, a travail, a work in order to get to the other. Normally, I offer something to be shared. It can be or it cannot. And people in life in general, not only in literature, offer whatever I can appreciate from them. And that might be very tiny, very subtle, very subtle. And as poets, we do work with the subtlety of what it means to be connected to someone. Voilà, c'est tout.
Thank you. So I want to pick up on a thread that Jami and I have been having in conversation for a while, which is that she wavers back and forth on what to call what she's written, whether it's a poetics essay or a poem or possibly something else. And I wanted to throw this out there to all of you. If indeed these are poetics essays, which we won't start from the assumption that they are, except by name under this panel, what does the poetics essay allow you to say or do that other forms of writing, and I'm thinking especially here poetry itself, what does it allow you to say or do that other forms of writing don't?
Excuse me, when you say the poetics essay, you mean a way of imagining what poetry should be? Is that what you mean by poetics?
Well, I'm coming from a perhaps false assumption that all of these pieces, we might consider them arguments about the nature of poetry and poetic language in a way, because they're all very self-reflexive about the work that poetry does, or, you know, the particular kind of a particular metaphor, a particular device, a particular operation of poetry. And so this question of like, when we write, what does the writing about poetry do differently than poetry itself? Or is there a different kind of space that this sort of, you know, meta exploration of poetry opens up, is what I mean.
I don't know, I'm going to talk again. I would say that poetry has intuition, and finally we get into, we find space in that intuition. And the poetics might have intention, and that's a very different posture. I know that in my writing, I don't try. It happens that I combine poetry and maybe the poetics together. They intertwine, in some way they tangle, yes. But it's difficult if you have an intention, unless you are a very old poet and you have to follow the rules of a rhetoric. You know, poetry was rhetoric finally, not only the rules of language. You had to know how to write an octosyllabe, an alexandrin, and so on. Otherwise, you couldn't say anything. And so that's something else. Today, we can use the language in different part of language in different way. It's very fluid. And by listening what you had to say tonight, it was fantastic, because I could see words popping from all the text. There is a new language to talk about poetics, or to talk about poetry, or just simply to be alive, because I could feel that we were not at all talking as even 20 years ago, and of course further in time. Okay, so now je me tais maintenant.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Nicole, this notion of intention, or maybe the opposite of that is just a posture of discovery, openness. And I think I might vie for a kind of bothness in this, where I might, like, for just thinking about how this, whatever it is, this piece came to be, it started maybe with the intention to respond to a question, but then something else happened. And so I don't know if there's some kind of difference between entree or beginning, and then what actually unfolds or happens on the page, occurs on the page in words.
I think,
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I think Jami's uncertainty about what to categorize or label her piece is instructive, because I think it is a super blurry line between poetics and poem. And sometimes, you know, it's annoying when a poem talks about the poem, and we want that secondary genre to do that self-reflexive work. but I think the older I get, the less I mind a poem talking about its poemness. And I think, you know, what David said a while ago about the poem is a stranger. Might be an argument for needing poetics to stand beside that stranger and say, you know, so maybe that's where it's coming in. But I think for me, it's not that the poem is purely an embodiment or an enactment, and that we need this secondary discourse to explain or bring knowledge to it. The poem is about knowledge, at least that's my interest in it, the kind of knowledge. So just reading from a tiny note, I have to myself a poetic statement, I guess, but it's directed at my own thinking about poetry. I wrote down, I work under the assumption that there is a valid pursuit of knowing that is lateral, oblique, latent, and relational. And this is the work of poetry. And I'm sort of paraphrasing Edouard Glissant from Poetics of Relation, I think, through that, if my memory is right. But I really value that, the kind of knowing poetry can produce. And I value its difference than, say, a straight up academic essay or an instruction manual or something like that. But I think both the poetics piece and the poem itself can do that kind of work.
I'd be a bit coy about answering this question. It's kind of a difficult one. I think genre is a kind of a frame which you can place around yourself, but you're obviously in kind of framing, trying to frame something, you risk constricting it or misrecognizing it, to go back to that metaphor. But you know, when Mandelstam is talking about poetry, one of the metaphors he uses is like a message in a bottle, and it's tossed into a scene, and you never know where it's going to end up. I mean, at the level of the line, for example, a poem, a transcendental poem, in the way in which Steven's talking about it, might be, it doesn't know, you don't know where it's going to end up. Whereas when you're writing prose or the essay, in a sense, you're kind of confined by the propositional logic of language, or you're confined by the concepts you're working with. But with poetry, things tend to be a bit more open, I find. And whether you're writing about poetry or indeed engaging with poetry, things lack the kind of frame, if you like. That's why I find it exciting. And it is a question of knowledge, but it's a question of not yet knowing where you'll end up.
Discovery.
Yeah.
I think maybe I'll just talk about what this particular project permitted. I don't do this that often. So, but I really found, I was really excited when I was offered the chance to do this. And I didn't know what I was going to do. But what I found it allowed me was a chance to reach into ways of knowing about poetry, but also history and the movement of languages and the disjunctures between languages, because the forms that I'm talking about, I don't speak the original languages of them, right? And so there's a way in which I can't really know any of these forms as they're originally conceived, and probably wouldn't dare to write about them except in a project like this, which seemed to me to be asking for and permitting a kind of speculation. And so I think that's what, because I mean, my essay in particular is I'm drawing from many disciplines that I don't really know a heck of a lot about. Probably wouldn't dare to do it in any other place or in any other place or time, but the project seemed to give permission to do that. And I found being able to think with a translator, critic like Watson's just really helpful. It was a kind of, for me, a kind of, well, it's exactly what I say at the end of the essay, a kind of inhabitation in a way that allowed me to know something for a moment anyway, before it slips away again, differently from how I might otherwise have known it.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could, I'm sorry, Deanna, I don't want
Go
to
ahead.
derail him, but
No,
may
no.
I would love to ask a question if we could come back. David, would you be, can we come back to this notion of the poem as stranger? And if I sort of got what you were saying, that it might be presumptuous to assume that there's a common language between them. And so what would, I don't know, what would get you to stop and encounter in some way the poem if it's stranger? Like, how do you, yeah, I think you get me.
Yes, I do get you. Thank you. I don't want to take up too much time before we move on, but that sense of the poem being the utter stranger or the absolute stranger is because precisely, you know, it's, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is kind of paradoxical. It's like what opens the poem for me is a kind of moment beyond language, which then comes back into language. So the poem on the page, or the poem as you're reading it, Jami, is not necessarily that poem I'm talking about as a stranger.
Yep.
So, you know, we try and grasp it in terms of materials and forms and lines and rhythms and all the rest of it. Well, that's not necessarily that moment of encounter I was trying to get at.
Yeah, no, I didn't think you were meaning it in any kind of concrete way. So that's why I'm asking. Yeah.
I mean, the way I think about it in a kind of odd way is like that kind of moment when Lazarus kind of gets up and tries to cross the distance between non-being into something recognizably as being, and it's like distance between the corpse and the form, or the first word. That's where I locate that kind of strangeness. But you can't really make sense of that strangeness. It's kind of beyond us.
Yeah.
And in that sense, something unfathomable. Sorry. Yeah.
No, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm conscious of the time here and wanting to give our audience a chance to offer some questions too, despite having basically infinite questions for you and myself. I will cede those to anybody in the room who wants to ask a question. And I'm thinking maybe if we can rely on your good graces for maybe 20 more minutes of discussion, taking questions from the audience. And the floor is open if anybody would like to ask a question.
I'll start maybe with one from the Cap Review offices here, because I have this burning question. I think it's partially been answered already by many of you around this idea that Nicole put so nicely around the intention versus the intuition of poetics versus the work of poetry. And I think something I was really thinking about in reading all of your work over the past year, as well as listening to you today, is this idea of readability versus unreadability. And, you know, what is this perfect balance between these two elements? Because I think, you know, something from that I know a lot of artists, not just writers, but artists just generally think about, particularly in contemporary art practices, relates to this idea of, you know, building unreadability into the work. I think that was something like an old prof of mine, Jami Macarty, really drilled into us as young art students. And so poetry, I think, has this innate, you know, presence of unreadability in it. And I think what is then interesting about the work of these so-called essays or non-essays is that they let you in to some of the thinking behind the unreadability and potentially provide for greater readability. And I'm just so curious to know if any of you think about the sort of function of readability in your work, and how, you know, how it adds to or subtracts from the so-called primary work of poetry.
There is a paragraph in my text which I did not read tonight, but it is also about readability. I was saying that I had a chance to review my text for a re-edition of These Our Mothers, which was written in 76 or something like that. And I could not make any correction. I could not, maybe I did one or two, but I could not go further than that. And then suddenly I understood that the book had to be written that way in order to be written. Otherwise, these Our Mothers would never exist. It would be smooth and soft and so on. So nothing of its meaning would be existing. And what its meaning is reality, fiction, and theory together, and trying to find the words first and trying then to write a sentence with those words, or a whole book with those words. That was the unreadable at that moment because of all the censorship of what might come from a feminine subject, from a woman's subject, contesting the reality, in fact, not all the other subject, but simply contesting what reality is for women and what fiction, the reality of women be called fiction. And so it was, there was a lot of exploration to do. And so unreadable sometimes means from almost impossible to translate in your own language what is for the moment old as fiction, but it is bigger than fiction, because fiction is not only the contrary of reality.
But when does reading actually begin? When you know something, or when you don't know it?
I think reading is there all the time. You read a very simple sentence, la baronne sortit, la marquise sortit à 5 heures, or you use one word, garden. I mean, everyone can read because each word is full of roots in a certain way, roots of life, roots of language, and so on. So I think that when we say it's unreadable, it's probably the rhythm of the conventional sentence in one language, probably, which has to be dislocated in order for other writers to make new proposition of life and opening on life as well. I don't know.
I'm just thinking about this notion of what's unreadable just to be. I suppose when I encounter something that I find unreadable, then I have a sense of being, I don't know, estranged from it or alienated from it, sort of kept from it in some way. Not, and that I don't know if there is a failing. I don't necessarily think it's a failing. It just is, but that there's some kind of lack of communing that happens, lack of connection that happens. That's both on my, that both I create and the writing creates.
I love the question of where does reading begin, because I think that shifts and changes all the time by context, by new capacities to read something that was unreadable, or even Nicole's description of looking backward and going, no, there needs to be unreadability here for some reason. I was just reading a book called Proto-Indo-European Trees. It's about attempt to reconstruct Proto-European language, but through tree names. And he uses all this pollen, fossilized pollen, to figure out where trees were at a certain point of time, and then map that onto the words for trees. And suddenly this erased language becomes readable through climate change and through where trees were migrating, and probably people too who are encountering new trees and coming up with a name for them. And that kind of weird mobile planetary readability unreadability is absolutely fascinating to me. I just want to throw one other little just phrasing into the mix. And when Emily Dickinson's poems were first published, this guy named Samuel Ward wrote like a fan letter to T.W. Higginson, one of the editors, in which he described Dickinson's poetry as the articulate inarticulate. And that seems to fit so well with so many of your pieces. from ghost words to submerged language to ellipses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As about this, how we articulate the inarticulate, or how we, by keeping it inarticulate, in a sense.
It is a mysterious impulse, though, reading, right? Like it comes out of like, where do we start? When do we start? What makes us start? All of that feels mysterious.
Can I throw something in here? I'm just thinking about forms of readability. I mean, it's not just with the mind kind of parsing words one after the other, but we're off reading in a lot of different ways. And one of them is a more kind of embodied way where you're reading. I mean, and I think we all do this with poetry and with art often, which is that you absorb. You're not thinking, oh, this is what this means. I understand it. I've read it. You're bringing it in and maybe having a different experience over periods of time. But that's reading. I mean, that is a readability, to be able to respond to a piece of work in different ways. And it may sometimes be a very mental process, and other times it may like absorbing a piece of music where it's in the rhythm of it, and which includes the spaces that you've talked about, right? To feel the silences, to feel the ellipsis. So I just thought, I mean, I don't think anybody was limiting readability to the narrowest form, but I just thought it would be useful to bring that out. But I also had a question for you, and for all of you, which is, did any of you have the experience when you were writing the pieces that you brought to this, of wanting to break away, of feeling a kind of, I have something else I want to write here that doesn't quite fit in this, but has been prompted by this, whether you called it a poem or something else, where you're in a sense doing parallel writings?
Judith, for me, there was something, I mean, it's what Steve was saying about how, well, both in the writing of poetry and the Poetics Essay, or whatever the blur is between them, that there's something really lateral in this way of thinking in any case. Mm-hmm. And the danger of it, of course, is that when one is thinking laterally, that it can just proliferate and just keep proliferating. And because you're not trying to sort of chase down the logic of an argument, you're not being driven down a tunnel, and the whole thing can just sort of spread open. I struggle with that hugely, and I don't have I mean, once the floodgates are open, I have a lot of difficulty deciding where the borders of the thing are supposed to lie and when to stop.
Yeah.
And even more so when writing poetry. I mean, I think that was one of the big challenges of Iron Goddess, is that it just seemed to want to keep coming, because it was like a pool of water that was just sort of spreading. And where, okay, well, I got to put numbers on it or something to do something arbitrary to stop it.
Got to put a net over.
Yeah, or something to stop it. But even to say, I want to be doing something else, it's like, well, which part is where does the else lie, and what is sort of part of the center of the thing when it's, always in motion?
Yeah.
I feel like that's what form is. Form is the arbitrary, the imposition of the arbitrary. And I mean that beyond like, oh, a sonnet has 14 lines. How arbitrary? How come it has why has it been that for 600 years? But I mean, especially in contemporary forms, I think we all find these, you could call it organic, I guess, but that word is troubling sometimes. But there's a kind of arbitrariness as any individual poet figures out, this is the way I have to shape this, because you're right, Larissa, I think that's the big problem, is where do you impose the shape on it?
Well, for me, space determines the shape. So space and silence and gaps and ellipses determine it. So, but Judith, your question made me think also of these different energies, within communications with one another, you like the gestural within poems, you know, and writing, the syntactic, the metered, and all of it, right? We're reading these different energies, those different valences, regardless of if we're interacting with someone or something, or actually reading a text. So I'll just see if I can answer your question really straightly. I was writing also a lot of poems at the time that this piece came forward too.
I just posted in the chat. I'm conscious of the time, so I think we can probably take one more question, unless you wanted to weigh in on this current question, David, before moving on.
I've noticed the questions in the chat, so I might connect what I was going to say to what you're going to ask, if you are going to ask the questions of the chat, but I'll wait and see what you do. Yeah.
I was going to cede the last question to anybody who wants to ask it. I was just thinking out loud in there.
Well, I mean, the chat, some of the people in the chat raised the question of arrogant knowledge. That's what I see. So about unreadability being attached to that kind of arrogance or the presumption of knowledge. And I think that's probably correct in some part, but if you take, if this is a genuine state of unreadability, then it's nothing to do with knowledge. I mean, so it's not about misremembering something or not quite remembering something, or not knowing or not being trained to know something. If it's genuine unreadability, it escapes you. It has to. So, you know, one example of non-readability or readability which is not quite unreadability is that when you're writing a sentence in these pieces, for example, you might cross out a word. Those traces may remain in your mind as you're writing the piece. They may not ever go away, but I wouldn't say that's unreadability. That's just rewriting or rethinking or whatever, but it's not knowledge. That's what disturbs me. It's don't rush to collapse unreadability into a question of knowledge.
Yes, which reminds me of Nicole, your sentence, certains mots se restent en suspens, that there's always this other to language that attends whatever is sort of physically present in the poem, which I think like we're all sort of circling around this void of what that something else or other to language might be.
Yes, there are so many possibilities, but I noticed the sentence of Jami when she says layers of interactive experience between saying and not saying, and then she will talk about ghost words, and indeed I've never thought of the ghost word, but they are, because language is always open, and sometimes we close it on us, but it's always open. For example, I take no chance with words that I know: a table, a window, a chair, because we are used to work with only one meaning to each word, as they have 5, 6, so many, and on s'appauvrit if we don't go and see what their possibilities are. Voilà, c'est ça. But it's the openness of language and the love of language also. There is the interest also in our stories, but it is the love of language which will bring us into poetry. I think that we cannot get to poetry if we don't have that passion, that love about language, about the mystery of language, which is our mystery. Yes, it is the mystery of human beings, the complexity, and that's the beauty of it. Yes, and I keep looking at that side. Otherwise, it would be very easy to look at a side which is not about life and love. No. Et c'est un euphémisme.
Those are great words to end on. My gosh.
Yeah, I think I can't do any better than that. So I just wanted to thank you all immensely for this incredibly rich conversation, which I'm hoping will continue on long after this event. Thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you to our presenters, Larissa, Jami, Stephen, David, and Nicole. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you to Jackie and Lauren for hosting. Thank you to the Department of English at Simon Fraser University for supporting this event, and especially the Warren and Ellen Tallman Writer in Residence Fund. Thank you to Spoken Web for promoting this event. And of course, thanks to the Capilano Review Contemporary Art Society and its various donors for making this event possible. So as many of our panelists mentioned, the works that you heard them read from today are in our 50th anniversary issues. Those are available through our website. 3.48 is just about to launch. In fact, I think is hot off the presses as of today. So you can subscribe and receive the trilogy of our anniversary issues, the glossary. Jackie's put a link in the chat there. And of course, you know, all of this programming is made possible through the support of our donors. So if you would like to support our programs and our commitment to providing fair rates of compensation for all of our contributors, please, we would love it if you donate. But most of all, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Deanna and TCR and David and Larissa and Jackie and Lauren and Steve and Nicole.
Thank you.
Thank
You,
you.
Capilano, and all.
Thanks, everyone. It was a
Ciao, ciao,
pleasure.
ciao.
Have a good evening.
Au revoir.
Hi, Jenny. Good to see you.
Okay, bye.
Bonsoir.
Bye, David. Thank you.
Wow.
Bye.